Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, Episode 37C, Nixon v. the Supreme Court with Michael Bobelian. Oh, and is that Bobelian? I pronounced that right? Excellent. I'm excited to welcome Michael Bobelian to the show today. Michael is a journalist and the author of Battle for the Marble Palace, Abe Fortas, Lyndon Johnson, Earl Warren, Richard Nixon, and the Forging of the Modern Supreme Court, which is the exact topic we're going to talk about today. I don't think I'm shocking anyone to say the Supreme Court has a conservative majority, and it's been so for decades, a majority that's only grown in recent years. But it wasn't always that way. In the 1950s and 60s, the court was at the forefront of the civil rights movement, with rulings like Brown v. Board of Education, which ordered the desegregation of schools in 1954, and Loving v. Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage in 1967. So what happened? Let's explore. Thank you for joining me, Michael.
Thank you, Kenny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. The story told in your book is a fascinating one. And as we heard in the title, there are a number of key players who feature in the story. So let's start with Earl Warren. Who was Earl Warren? What was his role on the court? What was his impact on it?
Right. So Earl Warren, I'll give you a little bit of biographical information. He was a Republican from California. He had been the district attorney of Alameda County up by the Bay Area, attorney general, and three-term governor of California. And he was an unusual political figure that wouldn't exist today. He had won 91% of the vote in one of the gubernatorial elections.
Wow.
And he was the Democratic and Republican candidate.
Whoa.
Because you could be in both primaries at the time. So he was this bipartisan Republican progressive. So a weird combination that doesn't exist today. And what happened was he was also a national figure. He was the vice presidential candidate with Thomas Dewey in 1948 for the GOP. They lost that race. And then in 1953, he is appointed to the Supreme Court by Eisenhower. And Eisenhower thought that Warren had a middle-of-the-road philosophy. That's what he thought. He said, he's a Republican, he's mainstream, he's not conservative, he's not liberal, and so he'll be a good justice. But it turned out that Warren led this judicial revolution in his 16 years as Chief Justice, not just in the setting of civil rights, but when it came to McCarthyism, voting rights, separation of church and state, the First Amendment, privacy, criminal justice. I mean, there's so many elements of modern life that the Warren Court not just touched, but fundamentally changed. And because of that, Warren is a titan of the legal world. If you look at the writings about him when he retired in 1969 and then he died in 1974 in his obituaries, people consider him, along with John Marshall from the early 1800s, as the two leading justices of all time. Many consider him to be as influential as most presidents, which is astonishing. And his brethren also really adored him and admired him. Even the ones who disagreed with him said he had this immense leadership ability to bring along the justices. They called him the super chief. And that reputation has stayed. Scholars still regard him as, like I said, one of the two leading justices of all time. And there's this website called SCOTUS blog. It's the leading forum on the internet about the Supreme Court. And about 3-4 years ago, they had like an NCAA bracket during the basketball tournament. Yeah, so they did that, and it was probably in March of 3-4 years ago. Yeah. And they had, I think it was 16 justices, and it came down to Warren and Marshall, and Warren was voted as the most influential, consequential. So whether you think he's the most influential or second most influential, but he's this titanic figure in the history of the Supreme Court, largely because of this revolution he led in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you for that great description, and I love the March Madness bracket.
Yes, that was quite clever.
In addition to being the Chief Justice of the court, Warren was no stranger to Richard Nixon, one of the other key players of the story. How did Nixon and Warren know each other, and what was their relationship like?
Right, so their relationship was very testy, and it went all the way back to their days in California. So, as I said, Warren was the governor of the state, very popular, right? And he was so that made him the leading Republican in the state.
Yeah.
Nixon was a young up and coming member of the House, and then he became a senator, and their personalities didn't match at all. Warren is bipartisan. He's very likable, very affable. People liked him. All right. He walked into a room, he had this magnetic personality. He didn't necessarily have a lot of close friends, but people gravitated to him.
Yeah.
Nixon is a loner and he's hyper partisan and he's kind of an attack dog type of politician.
Yeah.
And so the two just didn't meld. Their personalities didn't meld and their political styles didn't meld. So already they just weren't going to be on good terms.
Mm-hmm.
But the key break in their relationship happened during the 1952 Republican convention.
Mm-hmm.
So just some backdrop at the time, primaries weren't the way that we picked our presidential candidates.
Right.
It was still the old convention system, right?
Yeah.
So heading into that convention, Eisenhower, who eventually got the nod, was seen as the favorite, and Robert Taft was seen as like the conservative potential nominee as well. And they were like neck and neck with Eisenhower with a slight lead. And Warren had aspirations to become president, and he was a national figure. He would have had a decent shot at it had he been the nominee, but he also knew that he didn't have enough delegates supporting him.
Mm-hmm.
So he was hoping that there'd be a deadlock convention,
Mm-hmm.
which had happened in the past, right, throughout the 1800s and 1900s, and that he would be picked as the dark horse candidate, as the candidate that everyone can live with, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily going to be like a definite winning strategy, but it was the only strategy he had, and it had been done before successfully.
Yeah.
The key was to hold on to the California delegation because it had a lot of delegates. So you'd figure everyone there, including Nixon, who's a senator at the time, are going to support their favored son, right? That's what they were even called at the time.
Yeah.
But Nixon had struck a deal with the Eisenhower campaign where they said, look, if you can flip the California delegation to Eisenhower, we'll give you the vice presidency.
Ooh.
And so he tried. Ultimately, he failed because Warren was strong enough in the state, the delegates stayed with him. But that betrayal, Warren considered that a betrayal, stuck with him for the rest of his life. So fast forward 10 years, that enmity never went away. Nixon is running for governor of California in 1962. He had lost the 60 election to JFK. He's running for governor. And what does Warren's son do? Warren's son switches political parties, goes from the Republican to the Democratic Party, and he works on the Edmund Brown campaign, Nixon's opponent in the 62 election. And, Nixon loses that, and he's kind of humiliated by the defeat. Warren personally was very happy that Nixon had lost.
Yeah.
Warren, according to Warren's son, he considered Nixon an evil person, a disgraceful character. And I'm going to quote, the son even said, my father detested Nixon as an abiding passion. So you have this real personal hatred, if you will. And Nixon hated Warren also. He would call him a dumb Swede. He was like, oh, he's so pompous and he's so, righteous, that type of thing. So the two despised one another. And that, like I said, that relationship went all the way back to their time in California, but really the 52 election was where they had split for good and they never made up.
Got it. So Warren, firm place on the enemies list that Richard Nixon's carrying around.
Yes, definitely.
So you mentioned some of the big cases that the Warren Supreme Court passed down, Brown v. Board v. Virginia. You mentioned a bunch of the others. What did Nixon think of the Warren Court and what they were doing?
Right. So, Nixon, in terms of the civil rights cases, Nixon was actually quite liberal when it came to civil rights within the Republican Party, especially during the 1950s. More than Eisenhower was, and he was Eisenhower's vice president. So I don't think from the civil rights cases would have upset him so much. I think the criminal justice cases like Miranda and the many others that, beefed up the rights of defendants and kind of even the playing field to some extent between law enforcement and a criminal defendant. Yeah. I think those Nixon did personally dislike. But more than that, Nixon saw the Warren Court as a political opportunity. So when he's running for president in 1968, crime is way up in the country, and riots have been going on since the mid 60s. And in 1968, that was the biggest year of riots.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily equate the two today, but at that time, people considered rising crime like an assault, a rape, a murder, and rioting as one and the same, as this
Okay.
like lawlessness.
Yeah.
And so Nixon realized, wait a minute, who's everyone blaming for this lawlessness? The Warren Court, because of its rules. And you could see that maybe, okay, when it's an individual defendant, the Miranda rule holdings and things like that would help a defendant. But what the Warren Court had to do with riots, no one like ever made a
Right.
direct connection. But it was seen as like, you know what, they're to blame. So Nixon's view of the court is mostly a political one, and he's running against the court quite vigorously in 1968. So he's constantly bashing the court's criminal justice rulings. He's blaming it for lawlessness. And he's promising that he's going to appoint justices that are going to set things right.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part of how he uses the court politically is, the GOP up to that time had considered itself the party of Lincoln, and the Democrats monopolized the South since the Civil War era. But because of the 64 Civil Rights Bill, 65 Voting Rights Act, that's starting to diverge, right? So Nixon said, okay, Barry Goldwater did really well in the South in 1964. How can I capture more of the South? Well, I'm going to employ what they call the Southern strategy. And a big part of that was attack the Warren Court, and he never said, let's undo Brown. I'm not going to make that's false. But he did kind of say, hey, to the Southern audiences, I will appoint justices that are going to be kinder and gentler to your interests. And we're going to have integration, but we're going to do it more slowly, that type of thing. So it wasn't a radical like, oh, we're going to undo Brown v. Board, but it was sort of like, we're going to find justices that aren't so hostile to you, that are more friendly to you. So that's how Nixon looked at the Warren Court, was through this political lens, not so much through an ideological lens, because he wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't an
Right.
ideologue. He wasn't a pure ideologue, let's say the way Barry Goldwater was and the way conservators became thereafter. So to him, it was a political institution more than anything.
So I'm curious, he's trying to make it a political tool. What did the American people think of the court? You mentioned the South certainly didn't like some of the civil rights rulings. Was it a very regional opinion of the court? What was the general vibe toward the Warren Court?
Right, that's a great question. So the South despised, and by the South, let's say the white population of the South.
Very good clarifier. Right? Yeah.
Right, because the black population adored the Warren Court.
Yeah.
So, and despise is actually a mild word. We have massive resistance to Brown v. Board and integration. We have some things that have been now forgotten to history. In 1956, the Southern congressmen, almost all of them, signed a document called the Southern Manifesto, which called for open defiance of the court. They had these real cockamamie legal theories called interposition, where it said a state could nullify a federal statute or a federal court order. I mean, it dated back to the 1800s, and it had no constitutional standing, but they did everything they could to resist integration and to resist the Warren Court. But what happened was, so the bastion of the resentment of the court is based in the South, in the white population there. But then it spreads over time. It spreads during McCarthyism, because the Warren Court, in a series of rulings in the mid-50s, which have now been lost to history, but they were called the Red Monday rulings. And what it did was it put an end to the excesses of McCarthyism, the blacklist, the loyalty oaths, the harassment of witnesses by Congress, the really unconstitutional prosecutorial and investigatory techniques that prosecutors use, that Congress used to harass would-be communists. And this led to a huge backlash among different Americans. So again, they're not necessarily regional, but people who were cold warriors, who really were terrified that communists had infiltrated the government. They're thinking, why is the Warren Court handcuffing us, right? We have to get after these enemies of the state type thing. So now that creates a whole new set of critics of the Warren Court that weren't there because of Brown v. Board. And then in the 60s, you have new people joining this coalition, if you will. And some of those people joined because of the school prayer. decisions. And so prayer in public schools was very commonplace in America. Um, Even though you'd figure, well, isn't that violate the First Amendment, religious establishment, that type of thing? But it was widespread. And in 1962, the court said, no, you cannot have public prayer in public schools, excuse me. 79% of the public was appalled by that ruling. It turned a lot of religious people against the court. Then you have the criminal justice rulings like Miranda that we already went over. And then the final thing that really upset a lot of people was the one person, one vote principle. And this requires a little bit of explanation. We all know about gerrymandering today, which is very partisan. But gerrymandering at the time wasn't as partisan. It's weirder than that. The congressional districts and state legislative districts just had very different sizes.
Yes.
So you might get like 500 people in one county or one town had the same representation as a city with 200,000 people. In California, 6 million people were represented by one state senator, and 14,000 people were represented by a different state senator. So it just didn't, like, the math was so weird.
Yeah.
So the court, through a series of rulings, says, you know what? Each legislative district pretty much should be the same size. We know we can't do it like voter for voter, right? Because populations are always changing, but they have to be equally sized. Now you figure, you explained this to a 10-year-old, and I did to my daughter at the time. I tried to explain to her what that meant, and she was like, yeah, that makes total sense. It's fair, right?
Yeah.
But look at all the congressmen and look at all the state legislatures who owed their jobs to these warped legislative districts. They were hugely angry with the court.
Yeah.
And so they tried to pass a series of constitutional amendments that would overturn the ruling, that they even tried to create like a new Supreme Court that would be run by state justices. So really radical measures. Everett Dirksen, who was the Republican head of the Senate, he was the Senate minority leader, spent years of his life and political capital trying to pass constitutional amendments to undo the one person, one vote ruling. And when all of those fell short, because it's really hard to pass a constitutional amendment, you need supermajorities, he actually tried to call for a constitutional convention. That hasn't been done since the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And 33 states joined on. They only needed one more state to be able to call a convention. So you got all these forces, right? The South, the communist rulings, criminal justice, school prayer, and it all builds up to this animosity against the Warren Court. Now, that being said, many Americans beloved Warren and his court, right? Because every time there were these attacks or these attempts to override its rulings, there was always enough support to back up the court and to back up its rulings. So liberals adored him. Centrists generally agreed with his rulings. LBJ was always a big supporter, both when he was Senate Majority Leader and President. And like I said, Warren, when he retired and died, had this widespread praise. And he's the first justice actually buried to lie in repose in the Supreme Court. He wasn't buried there. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but to lie in repose in the court. So he's widely criticized, but also widely praised and embraced. So it's a very controversial figure in that sense, but it wasn't all bad. The bad is easier to explain because it was so radical in its scope and nature. But if you didn't have the support, there's no way the Warren Court would have been allowed to continue the way it had for 16 years.
Okay, so we're like halfway there to setting the table for the story we're about to tell. We've talked about Nixon. We've talked about Warren and the court. Let's turn to LBJ and Abe Fortas and what's going on there. So in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson became president. 2 years later, he nominated Abe Fortas to fill a vacancy in the court. So who was Fortas? How did LBJ know him, and why did he nominate him?
Right. So Abe Fortas was LBJ's lawyer. He was his friend. He was his advisor. He was his fixer. He was his confidant. So they were very close. And in fact, when LBJ eventually made it to the Senate, because he had been in the House for more than a decade, he won the Senate primary in Texas in 1948. And at the time, Texas, if you won the primary, you were going to win the state.
Yeah.
All right. So that's essentially the general election is the primary.
Yeah.
And it was very controversial. He won it by 87 votes.
Right.
And there were talk of corruption and ballot chicanery. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And Fortas represented LBJ throughout the process, and ultimately he prevailed. So it's not just he's an advisor and lawyer. At probably the most important moment up to the 64 presidential election of LBJ's political career, Fortas is there. So they're very close. Now, why nominate him besides the fact that they're good buddies?
Right.
LBJ realized Fortas would be a very reliable liberal on the court. And that goes in two ways. LBJ grew up during the New Deal.
Yeah.
That's when he entered politics. He saw what the Supreme Court did to FDR's New Deal legislation in the early years of the New Deal, right?
Yeah.
So he said, I have these big plans for the Great Society, right? Not just the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, but all these bills that are, dozens of them that are going to come about. And he said, I don't want the court to strike these down. So I want a reliable liberal there to make sure to protect this legislation from constitutional scrutiny. But LBJ also realized the court can reach parts of American life and politics that the political branches can't, like the one person, one vote principle, right? Like it's very theoretically the political branches could amend the Constitution, but that's so hard. So he said, I want a reliable liberal also to kind of go into these areas of American life that Congress and the president are unable to reach. So that's one reason to pick him. Two, Fortas was an absolutely amazing lawyer. His colleague called him the brain surgeon you call in when all else fails. I'm a lawyer as well. And we had a term, like if you were a really good lawyer, you were said to be a lawyer's lawyer. Like you're not just advising lay clients, you're advising people who are already lawyers. They already know what they're doing. But Fortas was considered a lawyer's lawyer. Really, yes. Just brilliant guy. He actually did the oral arguments in a Supreme Court case called Gideon v. Wainwright, which established the right to counsel for poor defendants. And it was considered one of the best oral arguments ever. So reliable liberal, brilliant, and LBJ being LBJ, he kind of wanted to spy on the court. He wanted Fortas to let him know what's going on inside the court. And frankly, they stayed way too close after Fortas got confirmed. We can get into that later, perhaps. But Fortas was still his advisor, his friend, his lawyer, his counselor, even though he was on the Supreme Court after 1965.
Yeah, LBJ doesn't let go of you, like, ever. How did that 1963 nomination go? Was there any controversy putting him on the court?
Right. No, not at all. So the whole thing from the day Fortas is nominated to his confirmation takes about 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. The hearings last about 3 hours, and Fortas is given these, softball questions.
Yeah.
And look, at the time there were no litmus tests, no background checks, and Fortas was confirmed through a voice vote.
Woo!
Right. And when I first saw that, there's a site on the U.S. Senate that lists like all the nominations going back to George Washington. It just says V. Right. For the vote.
I've looked at that site, yeah.
Right. What does V mean? And then I'm like, voice vote, where the Senate just says all in favor, yay, all against, say nay. That's how casual it was. Now, here's the thing. This wasn't limited to Fortas. This is not an anomaly.
Right.
From 1894 to the late 60s, only 1 out of 46 nominations had been rejected. About two-thirds had been confirmed through a voice vote. The hearings tended to be short. The time it took tended to be weeks, sometimes days. Again, there were no background checks. There was no ideological litmus test. So it was just a very different confirmation process. And Fortas fit into that naturally. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't some aberration from the norm. That was the norm of the era.
Okay, so we've got the political table set as we're heading into 1968. You got LBJ in the White House. You got Warren's the Chief Justice. Fortas is an Associate Justice. They're both on the Supreme Court. And you have Nixon running for president. And in this time, in June of that year, the middle of a presidential election, Earl Warren submitted a letter of resignation to LBJ. And that's really what kicks everything off. So first question, why did Warren decide to retire at this moment? Not earlier, not later. Why not just ride the job to the grave like people seem to do today?
Right. That is the great question. I don't have a complete answer. I know why the timing. Mm-hmm. Robert Kennedy is assassinated on June 6th.
Yeah.
And when that happens, and remember, LBJ is not running. In
Right.
March, he said he's not going to run for reelection.
Yep.
So at that point, Warren thinks and realizes Nixon's probably going to win the White House.
Ah, okay.
And he's and his letter of, he resigns, or he tells LBJ that he's going to resign 5 days after the Robert Kennedy assassination. So Warren times it because he doesn't want Nixon picking his successor.
Yeah.
Now that part I know, I'm very confident of. It's in the record.
Yeah.
Now, why didn't he? And remember, we already established that he hated Nixon, right?
Right.
And Nixon's bashing the Warren court constantly during the campaign. So he doesn't want Nixon picking his successor. Now, in terms of the last part of your question, like, why didn't he write it out? That I don't know. Like, there's no record of, maybe his grandchildren might know, his health was waning. He died in 1974, or maybe he wanted a couple of years, to enjoy his family more. That I don't know why he didn't think, hey, let me just keep going until I can't anymore. But in terms of the timing of why he wanted to resign, it was so that Nixon couldn't pick the next Chief Justice.
Okay, that's fascinating with the RFK influence there.
Yes.
Now, weeks after he tells Johnson he wants to resign, LBJ nominates Fortas to the Chief Justiceship to replace him. How was Johnson expecting this nomination to go over, and what did he get instead?
Right. Well, he was expecting it to be easy, and frankly, just about everyone was. The New York Times had already coronated Fortas. All right. Everyone in Washington, or most people in Washington, I should say, thought, hey, this is a shoo-in. Part of the reason was we talked about the long history where the Senate basically confirmed people easily, quickly, right? So why would this change? Fortas had been easily confirmed 3 years earlier. Everyone really thought that LBJ still had this mastery over the Senate, right? He was called Master of the Senate.
Right.
The Democrats had about a 2-to-1 majority in the Senate.
Yeah.
Okay. And then LBJ just kind of clinched the deal. He went to the Senate's leaders. He went to Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader. Now, today you would say, well, how could a Democratic president go to a Republican? It seems unheard of. But at the time, Congress was much more bipartisan.
Yeah.
And the two were friends, and Dirksen had played a key role in the '64 Civil Rights Act, for instance. So they had done this before. This was not an foreign concept to them. And Dirksen said, you know what, LBJ, I'll secure the Republicans. They won't fight this. And then LBJ also went to Richard Russell, who's the head of the Southern Democrats.
Yeah.
So again, sounds weird today, but Richard Russell was a segregationist, an ardent segregationist, but he had been LBJ's mentor and friend, so they still worked together. Again, weird. Okay, but they did, and he would come to dinner at the White House. He was LBJ's advisor still, and so LBJ went to Russell and said, "Can you keep the Southern Democrats in line?" And Russell didn't like Fortas, but he said, "I'll take care of it." So under all these circumstances, LBJ thinks like, yes, this is going to work out, but it turned into a huge fight. Instead, and we could go into the details, but basically it became this protracted fight that lasted another 4 or 5 months. And part of the reason was Dirksen couldn't hold the Republicans in line. His caucus basically rebelled against him, and that was led by Strom Thurmond.
Oh.
Right.
So had Strom switched parties? He used to be a Democrat, right?
Yes, he switched in 1964.
There we go.
And he became a Republican. The other Republicans who rebelled against Dirksen were Howard Baker from Tennessee, who became Reagan's chief of staff 2 decades later, and someone who's not as well known, but a freshman Republican from Michigan, Robert Griffin, also rebelled against Dirksen. And they all had different reasons. Thurmond because of the Brown v. Board and the civil rights cases, but Griffin was much more of a point of view of, why is the Senate rubber stamping all these selections, right? Mm-hmm. Why don't we have more scrutiny? Why don't we have more of a say in who gets nominated? So they had different reasons, but either way, the Republicans rebelled against Dirksen. They vowed to stop Fortas. Richard Russell and LBJ had a falling out over the appointment of a federal district judge. And so now Russell said, you know what? He was really upset. He thought he was being extorted by LBJ, like, hey, you better support Fortas or this judge that you want appointed in Georgia. I'm going to hold that over you. So Russell said, you know what? I'm not going to abide to our deal, and he actually now went against Fortis. And the other thing that we have to realize is in the middle of 68, LBJ is extremely unpopular within his own party, right? So the Senate liberals who should have really backed Fortis, because they hate LBJ over the Vietnam War, because Fortis is seen as his guy,
Yeah.
right? Because they've been so close historically and remain close, they just didn't really put in the fight that they would
Wow.
normally put into an ideological clash over the future of the court. And then lastly, LBJ wasn't running for re-election, so a lot of the political capital he would have, right? Like he could threaten people, like you want that hospital in your district, not going to happen, right? Or you want to build a bridge in your state, or you want money for this, not all those threats he could make and all the favors he could dole out, they're not at his disposal because he's not going to be president in a few months. So for all of those reasons, what should have been an easy fight in his eyes turns into this battle for the ages.
Okay, so we have all these people for various reasons opposing Fortis. Publicly, what was their case? What was the reason that they said we can't have Fortis as they made the argument to the country?
Right. So publicly, some of the arguments were cockamamie. First, they said did Warren really retire because he wrote the resignation letter as like, I'll stay on until you find my successor, rather than I'm going to retire October 1.
Yeah.
And he did that because he said that the chief justiceship should not remain empty. That chair shouldn't remain empty. It's really bad for the court's operations. And it had been done before, and Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a similar letter. So that argument kind of fell away, but all these arguments were done to kind of delay things.
Yeah.
The second argument they made, and this we heard in 2016 with Merrick Garland's nomination, it reappeared, was that, hey, LBJ's a lame duck. He's not going to be president, so why not let the next president, whoever that might be, pick the next chief justice? Now, did this have sound historical precedent? No. Going back to Washington's time, half a dozen presidents had nominated 16 justices. And in fact, and in recent memory, for those in 1968, October 1956, Ike is running for re-election.
Yeah.
He picks William Brennan, and he makes him a recess appointment, which means he's going to sit on the court, and then the Senate can confirm him months later if it feels like it.
Right? Yeah.
No one said anything. So it's not so on the surface, lame duck argument, just as in 2016, sounds plausible, but it really didn't have strong historical precedent. The main legitimate argument they had was that Fortis had been too close to LBJ while he was sitting on the court, because he was writing speeches for LBJ. He was advising on legislation. Look, he attended more cabinet meetings than the U.S. ambassador to the UN.
Wow.
So now that also shows you how smart he was, that he could be a justice and be a presidential advisor. So that was a more legitimate argument. But most of the arguments they made to the public was, we don't want any more liberal justices. So they brought back up the criminal justice rulings, and they brought into the debate something we don't think about anymore, but pornography was a big culture war issue of the 1960s. Playboy magazine was one of the top 2-3 most subscribed magazines in America. Hugh Hefner was a household name. You have the sexual revolution going on, right? But at the same time, many Americans, especially older Americans, really were shocked by what they were seeing. So this was a culture war issue, and the court was stuck in the middle of it. It didn't know what to do in terms of what qualifies as, pornography that you could censor versus pornography that's more artistic or that has a First Amendment protection. So it was a mess. Legally, constitutionally, it was a mess. But Fortis's opponents used that against them, and what they did was they brought in Charles Keating, who was involved in the savings and loan scandals in the 1980s, but in the 60s, he was the head of the leading anti-porn institution of the time, and he and one of his employees of this organization, they testified basically saying that the Supreme Court is to blame for the proliferation of pornography. And then that led to the Fortis Film Festival. So Strom Thurmond said, you know what? Why don't we watch some of these movies that the court has protected from censors? And so there was a month in August of 1968, as insane as it sounds, and it's never happened before or since, the court was watching, no, not the court, sorry, the Senate was watching pornography to review the heinous material that Fortas and the Warren Court had allowed. So those were the official reasons that they used to explain their antagonism to Fortas's nomination.
In 2016, you've referenced the 2016 election,
Mm-hmm.
the similarities there. That also became a huge part of the presidential election. Was that a factor in 1968 as well? Nixon, you mentioned he was campaigning against this court. Did this open seat become part of the campaign?
Yes, it did become part of the campaign, but he didn't do it overtly, meaning he didn't overtly say, hey, you should reject Fortas. Behind the scenes, he did say that. So at the GOP convention in August, it's in Miami that year, he's telling the delegates, especially the Southern delegates, look, you strike Fortas down, Warren's going to retire, during my presidency, I'll get you a person that's more amicable, that's more friendly to your interests. So behind the scenes, he's definitely telling the Republicans, at least, to oppose Fortas. And then publicly, even though he's not specifically saying, hey, reject Fortas, he's campaigning against the court. So he's kind of telling the electorate, you elect me, and I'm going to bring in what they called at the time strict constructionist conservative justices. So in that sense, it was a campaign issue, but it wasn't as overt and as specific as it was in 2016, where Donald Trump is basically saying, hey, elect me. Here are my list of justices, that I might pick, and we won't get Merrick Garland. Like that was more of an overt tie in recent times. Nixon wasn't as overt, but the message was clear both behind the scenes and to the public that, hey, elect me, and I'm going to get you conservative justices for sure, and we won't have Fortas and Warren and the Warren Court's ideological liberals, continue on the court.
And who won this fight? Does LBJ and Fortas win? Do they go down in defeat? Is the opposition wins? Who wins and how do they win?
Right. The opposition ultimately prevails. And they do it, as we already talked about some of the arguments they made. And a lot of these arguments fell by the wayside. But what they did was they gradually eroded the support that Fortas had. So the initial vote counts coming out of the White House in June are about 65 senators supporting Fortas. But over time, they had these tallies that people in the White House did, sometimes people in the Department of Justice did, and you could see them going from the high 60s to the high 50s and gradually eroding. And as we're getting closer to the election, that's a lot of what the opposition wanted was, we get closer to the election, now it's like, well, why not let the next president pick? It's not June, it's October, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then we already talked about, Johnson losing the support of Dirksen and Richard Russell, and the film festival.
Right.
The last two things that really torpedoed Fortas was in September. It's the final hearings leading up to an eventual vote on his nomination. There's this Robert Griffin, that senator I mentioned from Michigan. He gets a tip. His office gets a tip that the American University Law School had hired Fortas to teach a course, which is fine, but they were paying him about $15,000 for the course that normally they would pay someone $2,000. So it seemed sketchy, and of course that money was funded by Fortas's former clients when he was at a big law firm in D.C.
Interesting. Yeah.
That now cast doubt about his ethics.
Yeah.
And a lot of his last supporters in the Senate were like, we're done with this. So they kind of lost their energy, their strength, what little of it was remaining. And then the final thing was, this was the first time that a nominee faced a filibuster. It had never been used. We know the history of the filibuster with civil rights bills, right?
Yep.
But it had never been used to target a Supreme Court nomination. This was the first time that it had been used that way. Fortas actually did get a bare majority. He had 45 to 43 votes, but he needed 59 to overcome the supermajority you need to overcome the filibuster. So ultimately, his nomination crashes, and Warren stays on the court, and Fortas stays on the court as an associate justice. And it really created the modern confirmation process, which maybe we could talk about later. But that's how it all went down. Was like it took all of these circumstances, and then the filibuster, the ultimate parliamentary weapon, to defeat Fortas.
Well, one topic that hasn't come up, I'm curious if this was part of it. Fortas was Jewish. Was anti-Semitism at all a part of this opposition?
That's a great question. and it's hard to gauge. So, a lot of the Southern senators who had no problems saying, terrible racist things, bigoted things, white supremacist, speeches, right, in public, not just in private, but in public.
Right. Yeah.
In public, they were very careful not to say anti-Semitic things. So that's why it's hard to gauge. In private, there is some evidence of anti-Semitism within the Senate. And if you look at the Senate Judiciary archives, and they're in the National Archives in D.C., there are a lot of anti-Semitic letters saying, Fortas is part of a Jewish conspiracy, terrible, bigoted things like that. So you certainly see it within the public.
Yeah.
Or some percentage of the public.
Yeah.
You don't overtly see it in the Senate. You kind of see it here and there. So that's why I wish I could give you a gauge. Like I said, if you looked at how did these senators feel about civil rights? Their public statements made it clear, right?
Yeah.
It's just harder from the record that we have to point to a heavy degree of anti-Semitism, but it was definitely a factor. Just how much of a factor, I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. So LBJ, he withdraws Fortas, his nomination, on October 1st. Just over a month later, Nixon does win that 1968 presidential election. And once inaugurated, Nixon nominates Warren Burger to the Chief Justiceship in May of 1969. So who was Burger? Why did Nixon nominate him? And how did that go over with the Senate?
Right. So Warren Burger was an appellate judge and a Republican. Now, normally appellate judges don't publicly criticize the Supreme Court, but he did. He did in a couple of speeches. He wrote some things. And so Nixon saw the name and said, hey, I like this guy. And Warren Burger was also kind of auditioning for the job. He would write letters and memos to Nixon, advising him on, how to run the judiciary and things like that. So they liked each other. He was a Republican. And you have to realize, Kenny, between FDR, Truman, and then Kennedy and LBJ, there are just not that many Republican judges because you only have 8 years of Eisenhower.
Right.
So if you're looking at the federal judiciary to pick a Supreme Court justice and you're a Republican in 1969, you're like, it's not like there's dozens of candidates to pick from, right? So Burger stuck out as one of the stronger appellate judges. And like I said, he had been overtly against the Warren Court. And he kind of looked the part, like his mannerism, his baritone voice, and he kind of looked like the archetype of what a justice would have looked like in 1968. So he's nominated. He gets confirmed very quickly. It's 74-3, the vote in the Senate, largely because he's not seen as far right. He's not seen as liberal, obviously. And frankly, the Senate was exhausted from the fight they had with Fortas. So they were like, okay, this guy is not controversial. Let's just, confirm him. And so Burger is confirmed rather quickly and easily.
So Burger's quickly confirmed. He's obviously an opponent of the old court. Warren's out, Burger's in. But Nixon did not stop there. What did he do next to continue this transformation of the court and show he wasn't done with Abe Fortas?
Right. So that's where it gets crazy again. So, so we already talked about Fortas is, rejected as Chief Justice in October of 68. In May of 69, there's an ethical scandal because of a relationship he had with a corporate raider who had been convicted of a white collar crime. And
it's important to note he's still an associate justice, so he's still on the court as an associate justice. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for explaining that. But he resigns under scandal. So now all of a sudden there's a second opening. It's not just Earl Warren retiring, it's Abe Fortas resigns. And Nixon now with the second opening says, okay, I have Warren Burger. He's going to be Chief Justice. And remember that Southern strategy I mentioned.
Yeah.
Nixon is intent on appointing a Southern judge because that's the main way he's going to woo Southern voters in the next election.
Yeah.
So he tries to do this. He first nominates a judge named Clement Haydensworth, who is defeated largely by a coalition of labor unions and civil rights groups. They claim that he was anti-civil rights, anti-labor, that he had conflicts of interest. So he's defeated 45-55. So there's still the Fortas opening.
Yeah.
That goes through all of 1968. So now we get into all of 1969. Now we get into 1970, and Nixon nominates G. Harold Carswell, another federal judge.
Mm-hmm.
And he has even more opposition, again, from civil rights groups, but also because of people who questioned his competence. They really thought that he was a mediocre, in fact, below average judge. They're like, we cannot have this, this lowly jurist join the Supreme Court. And there's an astonishing memo or letter I had seen signed by dozens of former Supreme Court clerks saying this guy is not qualified to be appointed to the court. And it includes names like Dean Acheson, who had been the former Secretary of State, and names that weren't famous yet, but like Stephen Breyer, for instance, for future Justice.
Yeah, future Justice.
He signs it. So both of these Nixon Southern jurists get rejected. Okay, and then he eventually picks Harry Blackmun, who backfires as a conservative judge to some extent because he's the author of Roe v. Wade. But politically for Nixon, it's a huge victory because Southern politicians and Southern voters say, hey, even though we couldn't get a Southerner on the court in 1969, 1970, he made a valiant effort to do so. And then after Carswell's rejection, Nixon even gives a speech where he says, this is not fair just because someone's from the South. That shouldn't be the reason you oppose his nomination. So he really wins a lot of political support in the South, in part because of these two failed nominations. But ultimately, Blackmun fills that role in 1970. And by the way, that means Fortas's seat was empty for almost a year.
It's wild. I'm curious. I'm trying to remember. Was there any racism attached to the two Southern justices he appointed? Did they have any of that kind of against them also, or were they?
Especially Carswell. Yes, he had made some speeches and he had some racist rulings.
Yeah.
In the 1950s, speeches in the 50s, rulings in the 60s that the civil rights community came out heavily against him. With the earlier one, Hainsworth, it was more the unions were against him, and there were potential conflicts of interest where he ruled on cases where he had a financial interest in one of the companies. It was a small financial interest. I don't think let's put it this way, people had said, if this had happened in 1965, Hainsworth for sure, the first of these two Southerners, would have been confirmed. But after the scrutiny Fortas faced, and after the fact that Fortas had resigned because of a similar financial entanglement, or not similar, but some kind of financial entanglement, now the scrutiny went way up.
Yeah.
So this old way of confirming justices where you're not really taking a close look, now everyone's being looked under a magnifying glass, and that's why Hainsworth wasn't confirmed. Carswell, the second one, he really was not up to the task. There were so many people in the legal community who were terrified that someone with this legal stature would join the court.
Yeah.
And look, it changed things for good in a way in this regard. Since then, we've only had the highest, legal minds join the court. Whereas before that, you had a lot of mediocre legal minds on the court. Like if you look at Harry Truman's picks, if you look at earlier picks from the 19th century, early 20th century, you're like, okay, these, I'm not saying anyone was done. I don't want to use words like that, but they weren't like the brilliant lawyers we have now. Now everyone on the court has an amazing educational pedigree, amazing legal background, right? Like they're all really the finest legal thinkers. So we might complain about their ideology or their partisanship, but it's very hard to say that they're not brilliant legal minds. But for much of the court's history, we did have a lot of mediocre legal minds on the court. So Carswell's rejection kind of put an end to that. You were never going to have that ever again. And that's been, and that has stood the test of time.
And I'd love to revisit and dive a little deeper on Fortas's resignation. I think I had read that Nixon had maybe put his pressure on his Justice Department to lean on Fortas, things like that. Is there any validity to that? Was there a Nixon involvement in pushing Fortas out?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of that started with an investigative reporter at Life magazine named Bill Lambert, and he started looking into Fortas's relationship with a foundation. Like I said, the foundation was run by a man named Lewis Wolfson, who was convicted of a white-collar crime.
Okay.
And he was paying Fortas, the foundation was, $20,000 a year to kind of play an advisory role, to kind of, sit on like a board of directors type thing.
Sure.
But we have to realize $20,000 was about half his Supreme Court salary. So that's an enormous sum
Yeah.
to sit on a board, right?
Yeah.
And the other weird thing about this arrangement was it would continue into perpetuity even if Fortas left the foundation, and it would continue to Fortas's wife even after he passed away.
Okay. That's a great deal if you can get it.
Right. So that financial arrangement looks sketchy, and it's being offered to him by someone who's at the time being indicted and prosecuted for a white collar crime. Now, Fortas never vouched for Wolfson. He never went to the Department of Justice or the SEC and said, "Hey, back off." He never did any of that. But the optics look terrible. So this investigative reporter brings up the story. He tells the Department of Justice, and once Nixon and his Attorney General John Mitchell get wind of this, now they start a full-blown investigation. They start leaking information about it. And so they pressure Fortas to resign. And the real coup d'etat that they pull off is the Attorney General Mitchell goes to Earl Warren, who is a stickler for ethics, and he shows him this information, and Warren basically says, you know what, we can't have Fortas stay on the court under these circumstances. So he gets the other justices to also pressure Fortas, more from a standpoint of I don't want the court tainted, right? Nixon from the standpoint of I can get rid of another liberal and put in another conservative. So again, it's weird dynamics, right? Warren and Nixon, as we already explained, despised each other. But they both kind of look to remove Fortas for very different reasons. And that's what led to Fortas's resignation.
In 1971, Nixon would replace 2 more justices as their health was failing, and just like that, nearly half the court were Nixon men. What was the impact of all of this, this turnover on the court and the nation through the rulings that were passed down by the court? What was the legacy of this battle?
Right. So the legacies are within the court. It ended the liberal court that was dominated ever since the late New Deal, but really during the Warren Court, where it was the height of the liberal jurisprudence. It ended that. Now, the court didn't become as conservative as it is now until about the Trump appointments, and let's say 10, 15 years before that. And that's partly because people didn't know how to find such arch conservatives and arch liberals. People weren't very good at it at the time. And I'll give you some examples. Harry Truman's 4 appointments. Right now, if we looked at them ideologically, some would be conservative, some would be slightly liberal. They were centrist. JFK appointed Byron White, who was kind of a centrist. It depended on the issue. Some things he was conservative, some things he was liberal. So the pool of candidates who became justices weren't so refined as they are now, where you're oh, this is a guaranteed conservative, this is a guaranteed liberal. And we've seen it with David Souter, Harry Blackmun, John Paul Stevens. We have more recent examples of that. But really, the last 25 years, everyone has kind of lived up to the ideology that was expected of them. So, but this is the turning point. Under LBJ and Nixon is the Warren Court ends, the conservative dominance over the court begins, but it is not as dominant as it is today. So, but it starts in that direction. So that's within the court. Outside of the court, it becomes this highly politicized institution. The confirmation process, as we had discussed, went from this casual, easygoing, almost when you look at it from modern eyes, you're what were these people doing? Why isn't the Senate scrutinizing? And why are the presidents so cavalier? Right? Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren. He appointed William Brennan. They're the liberal titans of the court, and he came to regret his decisions. But again, from modern eyes, you look at Eisenhower's picks, JFK's pick of Byron White, Truman's 4 picks, and you say, what were these guys thinking? What were they doing? So now the court becomes politicized, highly ideological, more partisan, and all of these events, starting in 1968 with Fortas's rejection, and then capped off by Nixon's 2 appointments in 71, those 3-4 years really changed the direction of the court, the direction of the confirmation process, and how we view the court. And it just gets more amplified over time. So they kind of set that, they made the change, And now we've amped it up. Now it's like perfected to the nth degree. And that's why we have the court we do today.
What lessons can we learn from LBJ and Nixon in this fight over the future of the court?
Right. So LBJ was the first president to really look at a justice's ideology. It's not that no one had done it before. Certainly, Republicans wanted to pick justices that were Republican in nature, right? So, and Democrats the same. And FDR, for instance, he wanted New Dealers on the court who would allow for more government regulation of the economy. So presidents had always considered ideology, but as I just said earlier, they didn't do a very good job of it because it wasn't something they paid too much attention to. And frankly, there wasn't the process of weeding out who has ideological purity. But LBJ is the first person to say, whoa, look what the court can accomplish if it has the right kind of ideologues. And so he's the first president to really focus on ideology the way he does. And he picks Fortas, and then he picks Thurgood Marshall a couple of years later. Okay. And so he's like, I want guaranteed liberals on the court. Nixon is the first president to so politicize the court in a way for electoral reasons. So again, presidents had done that. They had looked for, they would appoint justices from certain regions of the country, for instance. Like if there wasn't a Westerner on the court, they would pick a Westerner, and that was done in part to appease Western voters or Southern voters, right? And there was unspoken but so-called Catholic seat and Jewish seat on the court. So that would appease certain part of the electorate. So it's not that presidents never paid attention to the electoral consequences of who they were nominating. But Nixon again took it to a new level because he wanted Southerners, for instance, so that he could get the Southern votes, and it worked.
Yeah.
There not only did it work from the way we see it in 1972, he routes the South, okay? And Republicans had never done that, right? Because the Southern stranglehold over, the Democratic stranglehold over the South dated all the way back to the Civil War.
Yeah.
So it wins. But there are also a lot of memos and letters written to him by Southern politicians saying, your nominations to the court of these Southern jurists really switched the region to you. Like he did other things as well, the speeches he made and certain, appointments he made and et cetera. But this was the crux of his Southern strategy. And then when you go to 1971, it goes beyond the Southern strategy. He's the first president to look for a woman to put on the court. Okay. Now, ultimately, it doesn't work because of, how women's ability to rise in the legal ranks was so limited at the time. He just didn't have enough good experienced women judges to pick from. If he had, I think he would have nominated a woman judge. Okay. But he wanted to do that not because he was a feminist or into equal rights for women. Like there are these amazing recordings, right, from the Nixon White House tapes of him and the Attorney General saying these terribly sexist things about women, but he's like, well, we could get the women's vote if we nominate a woman. Likewise, he was looking for an Italian-American jurist so that he could get the Italian-American vote. Now, again, not because he was authentic about it. It was like, who gives me the best chance of victory in the 1972 re-election, right? Now, ultimately, he went with Lewis Powell, the Southerner, and William Rehnquist, who was much more an ideological pick. But it's no coincidence that Sandra Day O'Connor and Antonin Scalia, so the first woman and the first Italian-American, are picked by Reagan. Nixon was already looking at those constituents in 1971. So again, presidents had looked at the electoral consequences of the justices they would nominate, but no one had been doing it at the degree and with the focus that Nixon did. So between LBJ and Nixon, you have the thinking that goes into who gets appointed or who gets nominated today based on ideology and based on electoral consequences. And so they kind of create the modern court and the modern confirmation process, which didn't exist up to that time.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Michael and want to learn more about this fight for control of the Supreme Court, please pick up Battle for the Marble Palace, Abe Fortas, Lyndon Johnson, Earl Warren, Richard Nixon, and the Forging of the Modern Supreme Court from your favorite bookstore. You can also find Michael on all the social medias. Michael Bobelian. Thank you for your time, Michael.
Thank you, Kenny. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, as of this moment, he is the oldest president still alive. By the time the next episode comes out, he could be gone. It's time for Jimmy Carter, the naval engineer turned peanut farmer who rode one of the luckiest campaigns in U.S. history to the White House, only to suffer one of the unluckiest presidencies once he got there. Peace in the Mideast, hostages in Iran, and a canal in Panama. That's coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.